Since I was a child, I learned that the world wasn't made for those who wait. I grew up in a modest home in Quebec, where the cold cut through the skin in winter and hard work was the only way to survive. My father was a man of few words and many exhausting shifts, while my mother balanced 3 jobs to keep everything running. I watched all of this and promised myself that one day I would be on the other side, the side of those who decide, who never have to ask for anything from anyone. And I kept that promise. My name is Geneviève Moreau, and I built a real estate empire from scratch. I didn't inherit fortunes. I didn't rely on luck. I simply turned every opportunity into a stepping stone to get where I am today. Now, I own Moreau Properties, one of the largest luxury real estate networks in Canada. My decisions move millions. My words are heard in the most influential high society circles, and my name has become synonymous with success. But power comes at a price. At corporate dinners and gala events, there were always glances of admiration mixed with envy. Men in impeccable suits saw me as a prize. Women whispered as I passed by, questioning whether I had really achieved everything on my own. At first, I ignored it. After all, other people's opinions never paid my bills. But over time, I realized that loneliness came as an inevitable side effect of my rise. And then Nolan Tremblay appeared. He entered my life at the perfect moment. Tall, sophisticated, a renowned lawyer with a calculated smile and carefully chosen words. I wasn't naive enough to believe in fairy tales, but there was something about him that disarmed me. Unlike the others, Nolan didn't seem intimidated by my success. He challenged me intellectually, laughed at my sharp responses, and, above all, made me feel like I had finally found someone who matched me. Things moved quickly. Trips together, nights of endless conversations, dinners where he held my hand and made promises about a brilliant future. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I didn't have to face the world alone. When he proposed, I thought I was making the most sensible decision of my life. After all, I assessed risks for a living, and Nolan seemed like the safest bet. But life has a cruel way of showing us that even the most strategic minds can be deceived. I didn't notice the signs at first. Small changes in his behavior, questions that seemed too innocent, a discreet yet persistent interest in my business. "Have you ever thought about putting our assets together?" he would ask casually as we sipped wine in an exclusive restaurant. "And if something happened to you, I'd be unprotected, wouldn't I?" At first, I saw no harm in it. After all, wasn't it normal for a couple to share everything? But something inside me, an old and silent instinct, told me not to give in. So I delayed, changed the subject, avoided the conversation. That's when I started hearing rumors. A close friend, always observant, mentioned she had seen Nolan having lunch with another woman. At first, I brushed it off. The man was a lawyer. Meetings were part of his job. But then it happened a second time. A third. Small details began accumulating, forming a picture I was still reluctant to look at. Until one day, I saw it with my own eyes. We were at a charity event, surrounded by politicians and business people. Nolan, impeccable as always, smiled and exchanged pleasantries while I talked to investors. But when I turned, I saw him from a distance, in a discreet corner near the bar. The woman was blonde, elegant, and he was holding her hand with a touch that was far too familiar to be mere courtesy. At that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't disappointment. It was a snap, like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. He didn't love me. He never had. And I, more than anything else, hate being made a fool. I finished my glass of wine calmly and took a deep breath. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't confront him. I simply smiled at the people around me and carried on with my night, because now the game had begun. What Nolan didn't know was that while he was scheming against me, I was already 3 steps ahead. They say that a person's true character isn't in the words they choose to say, but in the ones they try to hide. Nolan always knew how to speak well. He always knew how to charm, measure every syllable, as if his tongue was made to seduce and persuade. But I learned that a man can lie with his mouth, but never with his eyes. And that night, at the charity event, When I saw how he held that woman's hand, I realized that everything I thought I knew about him was nothing more than a well-constructed illusion. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't ask for explanations. I just observed, like a player who, instead of making a move on the board, chooses to wait. But inside me, something was already changing. Nolan returned to me with that same smile that I once found irresistible. He kissed my cheek familiarly and slid his hand to the base of my waist as if everything was exactly in its place. I smiled back, as if nothing had happened. But at that moment, I was no longer the woman who believed in him. I was someone else. In the following weeks, I observed, calmly, without haste. Small details began to stand out, like cracks in the flawless facade of a building about to collapse. Nolan arrived home later, excused himself with meetings that had never existed before. His phone, once left in plain sight, was now always in his pocket, vibrating silently. Conversations cut short when I entered the room, glances diverted, deleted, messages. I could have confronted him right then and there. I could have laid everything on the table, demanded explanations, but that would mean exposing myself to more lies. And lies were predictable. What I wanted was the truth. The raw, undeniable truth. So I chose patience. I hired an investigator, not because I doubted, but because I wanted proof. Emotions can be questioned, but facts cannot. And the facts arrived quickly. Nolan had a pattern. Discreet restaurants, hotels where the staff already knew his name, quick meetings between work, commitments. He was careful, but not careful enough to escape a woman who knew the shortcuts of power well. I received photos, recordings, transcripts of conversations where he assured the other woman that it wouldn't take long before everything was settled. Before he was finally free from me. That's when I realized. To Nolan, I wasn't. Love, a partner, a woman he wanted to spend his life with. I was an investment, a profitable business he intended to exploit until the last cent before discarding me. And worse than that, he had already started planning his exit. My phone rang that night as I analyzed the evidence. It was him. I took a deep breath before answering. "Good evening, sweetheart." His voice was as always, controlled and gentle. I pretended to be distracted. "Hey, love, how was your day?" "Exhausting, I'm starving, but I think I'll be home a little late tonight. I need to take care of a few things at the office." I pictured the scene. Him hanging up and heading straight to meet the woman who was probably already waiting for him. I forced a smile as I replied, "That's fine. I'll have dinner ready for you." "You're incredible. What would I do without you?" The tone in Nye. His voice gave me an immediate answer. He would do what he had always done. Find another woman to exploit, another woman to deceive. But this time, he had chosen the wrong one. I hung up the phone and looked at the documents in front of me. The proof of every betrayal, every lie, every plan he had orchestrated against me. I could throw it all in his face that very night. I could end it directly. But that would be a waste. Nolan liked to believe he was in control. He enjoyed the feeling of having everything planned, every detail calculated. So why not let him think that a little longer? I smiled to myself as I gathered the papers and placed them in a black folder. He didn't know it yet, but his game was already over. He just hadn't realized it, and I would make sure that by the time he did, it would be too late. Time is a cruel ally to those who don't know they are being hunted. In the weeks that followed, Nolan continued living inside the illusion he had created. He came home late, claimed he was overwhelmed with work, flashed reassuring smiles as he kissed my forehead, and casually mentioned that we needed to discuss our financial future. I simply smiled and nodded, letting him sink even deeper into the trap I was quietly weaving around him. While he played, I rewrote the rules. I discreetly hired the best lawyers and forensic accountants in Toronto. I wanted to know exactly where his weaknesses were, where his mistakes lay, where his vulnerabilities could be exploited. I did it patiently, like someone building a castle, knowing that, in the end, it would serve to imprison the enemy. What I discovered made me laugh. Nolan was more predictable than I had imagined. His game wasn't refined, wasn't brilliant. He was like any other man who thought he was smart enough to deceive a powerful woman. He wanted a divorce, but not before ensuring he got half of what I owned. He was quietly shifting funds, registering small properties in his name, and setting up a legal foundation to make his claim. The most ironic part? He had no idea what was coming. One night, he came home late, his expensive cologne mixed with the subtle scent of alcohol. He was smiling in that way he always did when he was trying to hide something. I was in the living room, a book in my hands, waiting as if my only concern was deciding between reading another chapter or going to bed. He sat beside me and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice coated with that casual tone he used when he wanted to manipulate me. "We really need to talk more about our financial security. You know, protecting what we've built together." I lifted my eyes to him, blinking slowly, as if I had no idea where this conversation was headed. "Of course, love. What do you suggest?" He relaxed. I felt his body loosen beside me, as if my response had given him exactly what he was expecting. "We could start by putting some properties in my name. You work so hard, and I don't want you to have to worry about administrative details." "Really?" I tilted my head, feigning interest. He nodded, confident. "And maybe we could also open a joint account. It would make things easier. If something happens, one of us can manage everything without legal complications." I smiled, pretending to consider it. "That sounds like a great plan." He kissed me softly on the lips, satisfied. And I kissed him back, because nothing would make him suspect that, at that very moment, my victory was already guaranteed. The next morning, before he left for work, I slipped a document among the papers on his office desk. A simple sheet, a financial contract, seemingly a draft for review. Nothing that would draw attention. He didn't even notice when he signed it, and with that, I had everything I needed to make my final move. My marriage, my patience, and my trust in him had ended long ago. But Nolan still didn't know that his downfall was about to begin. The truth was right there, in the palm of my hand. At first, my only goal was to close any legal loopholes Nolan could use against me in the divorce. The plan was simple. Make sure he had no claim to what I had built. But fate has a peculiar sense of humor, and sometimes justice arrives in unexpected ways. The mistake was in the official records. When my lawyer called me in for a private meeting, I expected updates on the assets Nolan had been quietly shifting. But instead, she handed me a file with a hesitant look. "Genevieve, we found something unusual. It seems that your marriage was never properly registered." The words hung in the air for a few seconds, as if my brain needed time to process them. "What do you mean?" My lawyer turned the document toward me. There it was, the proof. The registry office where the marriage should have been recorded had never completed the process correctly. The reason? A bureaucratic error. The original form had been filled out, but never officially filed in the system. Legally, the marriage never existed. I should have been furious. I should have felt deceived, betrayed. But instead, something started to grow inside me. A feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time, satisfaction. Because this wasn't just a mistake, it was the final piece of my revenge. I calmly closed the file and looked at my lawyer. "Is this official?" "Absolutely. If he tries to claim any part of your assets in the divorce, this document proves he has no right to anything." I stayed silent for a moment, feeling the weight of that revelation. I could tell Nolan right then. I could show him the proof, shatter his illusion right there. But no. He had spent months believing he was in control, plotting his perfect escape, planning to leave this marriage as a rich man. He thought he was invincible, certain that his strategy was flawless. So why not let him savor that certainty just a little longer? I stood up, taking the folder. Great. Let him believe he had already won. In the following days, I carried on as usual. I attended dinners with Nolan, laughed at his jokes, held his hand at public events. I continued playing the role of the devoted wife while behind the scenes, I finalized my last move. The divorce proceedings were initiated by him, as expected. I received the summons as if it were a shock, as if I hadn't been prepared. Nolan came home that night with a victorious air, rehearsed words about how he wanted us to be civilized and reach a fair agreement. I nodded. Yes, of course, a fair agreement. I watched as he silently celebrated, believing that in just a few months, half of my empire would be in his bank account. He just didn't know that in a few months, he would have nothing. And on the day of the trial, I would make sure to witness the exact moment he realized it. The day Nolan had been waiting for finally arrived. The courtroom was packed, murmurs echoing against the polished wooden walls as lawyers adjusted their suits and documents were organized on tables. The judge was already seated, observing everything with tired eyes, accustomed to disputes like this. To him, it was just another high-profile divorce case, an ego battle, nothing more than a legal spectacle that would end with asset division and a bureaucratic resolution. To me, however, it was the conclusion of a game I had already won before. It even began. Nolan entered the courtroom with the confidence of a man who believed he was about to walk out a millionaire. He wore an impeccable suit, smiling at his lawyers as he adjusted the gold cufflinks on his wrist. He had that triumphant look, as if victory were already guaranteed. His legal team was aggressive, composed of the best divorce attorneys in Toronto. He had spared no expense. After all, to him, this wasn't a risk. It was an investment. I sat in silence on the other side of the room, my lawyers around me, all perfectly calm. There was no need for tension, no need to rush. The judge cleared his throat and initiated the hearing. Nolan's lawyers spoke first. They did exactly what I expected, dramatized everything. They placed their hands over their hearts and painted a picture of a marriage built on love and partnership, of a man who had dedicated years to my side, who had invested in my career, who deserved his fair share of our life together. Nolan simply looked at me from across the room, almost as if silently consoling me. I saw in his eyes the absolute certainty that by the end of that afternoon, he would have a favorable ruling. I waited. The judge turned to my side and signaled for my lawyers to begin. One of them stood up and walked through the courtroom, casually, opening a folder of documents, and then I spoke. With a firm voice, without hesitation, I looked at the judge and uttered the words that would change everything. Before we proceed, Your Honor, there is an important detail that needs to be considered. Silence filled the courtroom. I slid a sealed envelope across the table. This marriage was never valid. The impact was immediate. The judge furrowed his brow and picked up the envelope. Nolan blinked a few times, as if unsure of what he had just heard. His lawyers exchanged suspicious glances as the judge opened the documents and began flipping through the pages. Genevieve, what are you talking about? He tried to laugh, but his voice came out strange, unsteady. I clasped my hands together on the table and looked directly at him. You never checked the paperwork for our marriage, did you? Always too busy, too focused on getting what you wanted, never concerned with the details. But it turns out the registry office never finalized the recording of our marriage, which means that, legally, it never existed. The judge lifted his eyes and confirmed with a nod. Nolan turned pale. The room fell into absolute silence. His lawyers frantically searched through their papers, checking every line, every contract, every certificate, trying to find a way to contest the truth. My lawyer continued, his voice perfectly measured. Since there is no valid marriage in the official records, there is no legal basis for divorce proceedings. There are no assets to be divided. There is no financial claim possible. The air in the room grew heavy. I watched as Nolan started to sweat, as his confidence crumbled before everyone's eyes. His mouth opened to say something, but no words came out. The judge struck the gavel. Given this new understanding, this case is dismissed. The petitioner has no claim to any of the respondent's assets. Nolan shot to his feet. This is a mistake. This can't be. His voice came out louder than he intended, a desperate cry mixed with disbelief. I simply watched, unmoved. A mistake? I leaned slightly forward. No, sweetheart. The only mistake was thinking you could deceive me, when in reality I was always 2 steps ahead. The entire courtroom watched the scene unfold. Nolan trembled. His lawyers tried to calm him, but there was nothing they could do. His perfect plan had collapsed. His castle of sand had been washed away by the tide, and I simply savored the taste of victory. But I wasn't done yet. The final piece of my revenge was still to come. Nolan remained there, frozen, wide-eyed, trying to process his defeat. The silence in the courtroom was almost deafening. His body trembled slightly, his fists clenched, while his mind was likely racing to find a way out. But there was no way out. He had nothing left, no arguments, no claim to my money, not even his dignity. And I wasn't finished. The judge had already closed the hearing, but I calmly stood up, my folder of documents in hand, and turned to face Nolan one last time. He blinked a few times, trying to regain his composure, but the sweat on his forehead betrayed his desperation. That was the moment I slid another envelope onto the table. Your Honor, before I leave, I believe there is one more matter to be addressed. The judge looked at me, exhausted, but took the envelope and opened it. Nolan crossed his arms, trying to appear indifferent, but the tension in his jaw gave him away. This time, I didn't need to say a word. The papers spoke for themselves. Fraud, money laundering, embezzlement from contracts at the firm where Nolan worked, suspicious bank accounts in offshore havens. A scheme that, if thoroughly investigated, could destroy his career forever. The judge narrowed his eyes as he skimmed through the documents. His fingers drummed lightly on the desk before he took a deep breath and closed the folder with a sharp snap. These are serious allegations. My lawyer stepped forward, polite but firm. They have already been forwarded to the appropriate authorities. We are simply informing the court, as it appears the petitioner may have been attempting to use this non-existent divorce to cover up his financial misconduct. That was the final straw. The desperation in Nolan's eyes turned to sheer panic. He spun on his heels, looking to his team of lawyers as if they could save him, but they only exchanged glances. One cleared his throat, another hastily gathered. His papers, even his allies knew he was finished. We heard the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the courtroom. 2 uniformed officers entered the room, walking toward Nolan, who instinctively stepped back. His mouth opened to protest, but one of the officers was already holding his ID, confirming the details. Mr. Nolan Tremblay, you need to come with us for questioning. The color drained from his face. He turned to me, his eyes filled with fury and disbelief. You planned this. I smiled, adjusting my bag over my shoulder. You always liked to think you were in control, but you never realized that while you were playing your game, I had already won. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists echoed through the courtroom. Nolan struggled, muttered protests, looked to his lawyers for help, but no one moved. Everyone knew there was nothing left for him to do. As he was escorted through the hallways, I could hear his voice, thick with rage. This can't be happening. But it was, and now I could finally breathe. I walked out of the courthouse with steady steps, feeling the warm sun on my face. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, savoring the feeling of victory. I was free. Not just from Nolan, but from any shadow he had left in my life. And what came next? A new chapter. But before that, I wanted to watch the complete downfall of the man who thought he could destroy me. The city felt different that morning. The air was lighter, the sky bluer, as if even the universe knew something had changed. And it had. For the first time in a long time, I was free. The headlines captured Nolan's downfall the very next day. Renowned lawyer arrested for fraud and embezzlement. The scandal exploded in the news, and every detail of his rise and fall was dissected by the press. His name, once respected in corporate circles, was now synonymous with corruption. The companies he had contracts with immediately severed ties. Friends and influential contacts vanished like smoke. The criminal trials were swift and merciless. The investigation uncovered more than I had expected. Not only had he been embezzling from his firm, but he had also tried to register assets and accounts under third parties, probably as a backup plan in case his scheme against me failed. When questioned, he tried to blame his own lawyers, claiming he had been poorly advised. No one believed him. His assets were seized, his name erased from prestigious circles, and finally, the ultimate blow, his conviction. 5 years in prison, without the possibility of bail. When I heard the sentence, I simply smiled. But Nolan wasn't the only one who paid a price. The woman he had been cheating on me with was exposed as an accomplice in some of his fraudulent dealings. She, who once believed she would inherit the fortune of a man who planned to become a millionaire at my expense, now found herself caught in the middle of a scandal that ruined her reputation as well. I later found out that without access to Nolan's money, she was forced to sell her luxury apartment. In the end, she lost everything too. And me? I moved on. In the days that followed, I reorganized my life with the same precision I had used to destroy Nolan. I reviewed contracts, erased any trace he had left in my businesses, and cut every connection that had ever brought him into my circle. To the world, I was the woman who exposed a traitor and came out victorious. But to me, it was more than that. It was a fresh start. I bought a new house, bigger, free from memories of Nolan, free from shadows of the past. I started traveling more, slowing down, enjoying the things that had once been buried under the responsibilities of a marriage that had never been real. But the best part? I found myself again. For so long, I had been taught to believe that I needed someone by my side, that a woman like me should have a partner to share her success. But now, looking at everything I had done, I realized that I had always been stronger on my own. Nolan tried to bring me down, and in the end, he only destroyed himself. Time passed. His name faded into oblivion. He was still in prison, without influence, without money, without anyone. And me? I kept rising. One morning, I sat on the terrace of my new home, a cup of hot coffee in my hands. The city stretched before me, shining under the sunlight. I took a deep breath, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. And then I smiled. Because life always finds a way to settle the score. And this time, I was the one who made sure justice was served.